morning and welcome back. This show wouldn't happen without our sponsors, and so we would like to thank Intruder. Intruder is a powerful vulnerability management scanner that makes securing your cloud infrastructure a breeze. Rapidly scan your Amazon, GCP, and Azure systems for emerging threats, monitor your attack surface, and reduce the noise of non-issues. You can try it for free at intruder.io. And hopefully that will help you find some of the problems that David and Karl are about to introduce you to in their talk on an introduction to Azure Offensive Security.
Yes, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. So thanks very much for that introduction. So my name is David Okeyode. So do not feel any pressure to pronounce my last name like I like to say. I've heard it pronounced as Okidoki, Okeyode, just call me David and I'm good with that. So I am a Microsoft Azure MVP. I work with Microsoft Azure every time. So I'm a cloud security consultant in a company called Palo Alto Networks, the Prisma Cloud Speedboat. So Karl and myself just wrote a book on penetration testing Azure for ethical hackers. This conference was actually the time that Karl and myself were supposed to meet for the first time in person. However, unfortunately, COVID does what COVID does, so we're not able to meet. But yeah, I'll just let Karl introduce himself also.
Sure. So Karl Fosaaen, practice director at a company called NetSpy. We're headquartered in Minneapolis, but I lead up our Pacific Northwest team out of Portland, Oregon, along with our cloud pen testing team. I primarily focus on Azure myself, but over the last year or so, David and I worked on writing this book, and it's kind of a bummer that we don't get to see everybody in person here this week. I was really looking forward to finally meeting David in person. It's weird to write a book with somebody and not get to meet him in person, but thankfully we still get to do the presentation today, and looking forward to talking to everybody.
Thanks very much for that, Karl. So sort of like the way that we're going to structure this is, I'll sort of take like the first 10 minutes and then Karl is going to do like the last 10 minutes. And we're going to have like maybe a few demonstrations in between. So the agenda for today, we're just going to go through a quick overview of just the Azure platform and what Azure is about, and just some useful information for you. We're going to look at options talking about the Azure attack matrix, exploiting anonymous discovery and access in Azure. And we're going to be using an amazing tool that was written by Karl called Microburst. So many of you may have known about it. It's gotten Microsoft attention even, with Microsoft adding even some detections just specifically targeted towards Microburst. So it's an amazing tool. We're going to introduce how we can use that for anonymous discovery and access. We're going to look at exploiting credential access in Azure. It's been my own experience that in many cases, in many talks, many people focus on Azure AD, right? Azure Active Directory, and stealing OAuth tokens and all of that types of attacks. However, there are multiple credential types in Azure, especially when you're talking about service level access. So we're talking about just options like local administrators, options like just temporary tokens, long-lived access keys, like the ones for Cosmos DB that got exposed in the past few weeks. So I'm going to introduce some of that. Karl is going to cover harvesting Azure service passwords, and we're going to do like some brief information about that. So some of this I'll skip through because some of you that already are familiar with the Azure platform, you already know about this. So the Azure platform is not just one cloud, it's actually multiple clouds. We have the Azure Public Cloud, we have the Azure US Government Cloud, we have the Azure Gemini Cloud, which is going away, I believe, in October. It's going to be retired. And Microsoft has 2 new regions in the Azure Public Cloud that customers are going to have to move their workloads into that cloud before October this year. We have the Azure China Cloud, and we have the Azure Stack Hub, which just in my own opinion, and from what I've seen of the other cloud providers, is probably like the more matured option when it comes to hybrid integration with the popular public cloud platform out there. So anyways, when we talk about like the Azure organization structure itself, at the top of the hierarchy, we have something called the tenants itself, the Azure AD tenants, which is where we have our identities, the users, the group, the service principals, and the managed identities. So for those that are familiar with AWS, that the service principals manage the identities, that would be sort of like your roles, your IAM roles in AWS. And then underneath that, we have something called the root management group. So management group in Azure is not something that's always enabled. That would be the equivalent of like the root organization unit on AWS. But it's something that once a customer enables it, it automatically creates this root management group. And what that also provides is a central point to manage all your Azure subscriptions. But of course, if you make mistakes at that level, the impact is much more higher than if you make a mistake at a much more lower level in the hierarchy. So under the management groups, we can have child management groups. We can go up to 6 levels in depth in terms of the child management groups that we can have. And then we have our subscriptions, and then we have our resources in there. So, and the resources are the actual services that we're hosting our applications, storing our data, and all those other stuff. So Azure sort of like function a little bit differently from AWS in this sense that there's a separation between sort of like the identity provider and where you deploy your resources. So Azure AD roles are what we use to grant access to Azure AD itself. And that just natively is just separate from what is called Azure Outback role, which is what we use to grant access to the resources that we're actually hosting in Azure. And that is very good because here is what sort of like the Azure layer looks like. So just quick minute here. So the good thing about the way that Azure is structured in this way is that if you follow good practices and you have a user that you've assigned the user permission over here on the in the Azure AD tenant, you do not or you should not be assigning the user permissions to Azure Outback roles because that just gives opportunity to move laterally if that credential were to be compromised. So just keeping things separate. But of course, if people kept things separate, we won't have some of the issues that we've seen. So when we talk about in terms of offensive security, MITRE ATT&CK matrix is one that typically comes up. So it's, the MITRE ATT&CK frameworks covers adversary tactics, techniques, and procedure. It's globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics. So in the past, they used to have a specific matrix for the Azure platform, but that's something that they've actually removed and they've replaced with a much more generic matrix under the category of IaaS. So I'm not sure why they've done that, but if you want to have a look and check out the link, just go to the link on the chat window and it's going to take you straight to there. So moving on very quickly here. So the Azure attack matrix, so personally, I just build mine based on techniques and objectives that I've seen attackers use in the past and or causes of breaches in the past. And just listing them in order, learning from like the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, but just using them in order of the objectives that an attacker looks to perform in an environment and the different methods and tactics that an attacker uses to achieve those objectives, right? So we have objectives of trying to discover the resources, of trying to access credentials, of initial access. So I was actually quickly updating this as we were joining because I was going to add into the cloud provider not patching their runs, their container runtime. So, well, yeah, whoever's been listening to the news knows what I mean by that. So well done, Microsoft. So execution, privilege escalation, defense evasion, lateral movement, persistence, and some of the impact on some of the impact that can be done. So what what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just a few of these in this particular conversation. So for example, I'll talk about cloud service enumeration, and I'll talk a little bit about the credential access option. So when I go to the credential access option, I'll talk about cloud service credential access and some of the ways that that is done. And hopefully, in the book, we'll be able to, we did cover some more of these other techniques in the book with examples. So moving on very quickly here. So looking at discovery, two main aspects with authenticated discovery, where we have no information about, or we have very little information about the target itself, right? It's much more a wider range, wider scope. You're doing that without any credential being given to you initially. But then you have sort of like the authenticated discovery where you have maybe like a reader permission, more of like, assume breach scenario, and you're trying to discover resources and see how you can escalate privilege and move laterally within the environment. So in terms of unauthenticated discovery, cloud providers, similar to other cloud providers, they have the public IP address ranges published. So that's something that can be grabbed, and that's something that can be used to assess the cloud platform and then to discover services that may have been left misconfigured or services that may have been exposed on that particular account. So one thing to mention here is this is not something that you want to be doing without the permission of whoever owns the IP addresses. This is not something that's allowed by Microsoft. It's something that you probably need to get whoever you're working with to run an Azure CLI command to collect the static IP addresses that belongs to their resources and then checking those, not just running it randomly, because that goes against the terms of use of the Azure Cloud Platform. So just to quickly mention that, right? So, but the other aspect is Cloud Service DNS enumeration. And Cloud Service DNS enumeration, so on the Azure platform, we have platform services, and those platform services, when you create them, you have the resource instance name, and then you have the service DNS suffix. So for example, if I create something called the Azure storage account that has the blob service, I get an account, I get an instance with the name, and then with DNS suffix after that. And here are some examples of some popular, just common DNS suffixes for Azure services. So, some quick one that I'll be mentioning and focusing on today in terms of the Azure Container Registry and the Azure Blob Service that we have the example over there at the top. So here's some other examples of some of the other DNS suffixes that exist over there. So there are multiple ways that we can use to enumerate cloud platform DNS services. So the one that I'm going to be showing to you today is using this lovely tool that was created by Karl called Microbust, which I already downloaded. So if I switch over to the Microbust. So one of the good things about Microbust itself, it's focused on Azure, right? It's focused on Azure. So a lot of the permutations that Karl has used and other contributors of this particular tool that they've used are ones that are specific. So if you read Microsoft documentation, you see some of their suggestions on how to name resources, and it's sort of targeted towards the Azure platform. So it's not like a just generic DNS enumeration tool. So there are two main functions that I'm going to be focusing on when we look at Microbust here. So the first function that I'm going to be looking at, if I go ahead and I bring up my system over here. So the very first one would be this right here. So get help. So there's this invoke enumerate Azure subdomains. And what that's going to do is that it's going to use a built-in list. You can also supply your own list, and it's going to use that to go through the, just enumerate DNS and look for active resources that matches the DNS suffix that you've provided. So apologies, I need to import it first of all. So Karl is probably looking at me thinking, what are you doing? So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and import that first of all. And so actually, while I'm waiting to import that in that particular one, I believe I have another one over here. Yeah, so I can use this other session. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that. So the way that this works, just to mention very, very quickly, is you supply something called a base string. And in this case of the example that I ran, I specified a base string called spicy crabs. So, and that's what it's going to use for the search. However, you can also specify a permutation file that is going to use to essentially create different variances that it's going to search for. So, and you can use that to specify. The other thing that you can do is that once you've used Microbust to enumerate the different domains, in this particular case, when I ran it, it detected these different resources in Azure. So two of them that I'm going to quickly just call out, and then before I go ahead and hand over to Karl for this. So two of these I'm going to call out. Let's go back to over here. So two of them I'm going to call out is the Azure Blob Container And the reason why is because Azure Blob Container is one of the services that allows for anonymous access in Azure. It allows administrators and engineers to configure anonymous access. There's another Azure service called the Azure Container Registry that also allows administrators to configure anonymous access. So to attack these two services from an unauthenticated perspective, you need information about the resource name, again, which you can use a tool like Microburst to enumerate. You also need information about if you're targeting the blob service, the name of the container, and in some cases, if the public access is set at the container level, you can list all the objects in the containers anyway. But if the public access is set at the object level, you need both the name of the container and the object. And it's sort of similar for the Azure Container Registry. You can target the repository name, but also the name of the image, right? And if it gets the name of the image, in some cases, you don't even need to get the tag information. You can just, it's just going to pull down the latest version of the image in the container registry. So what I'm going to do here very quickly is I'm going to show this in action for the Azure Blob Storage. So let's go back over here. So to do that, I'm going to use another function that Microburst supports. Let's go ahead and clear the screen and make that bigger. So I'm going to use this function called invoke enumerate Azure blobs, and I'm going to specify again the base. And what that's going to do is that it's going to look for, it's going to look based on the base and the permutation that's specified, and it's going to look for any public container or any public objects that it finds based on the information that's specified. And in this particular case, you can see that it found some public containers and some public objects and files in that container also, right? And in that case, it's more of looking into them and looking at what they contain and looking if you can find maybe credentials or other useful information from there. So it works in a similar way if you're talking about the Azure Container Registry. Just to quickly confirm, because I think I lost track of time a little bit here. How many minutes do we have left?
I think we just have about 2 minutes left here.
Oh, really? Wow. Oh, okay. Pretty wow. Quick. Wow. Okay. Apologies for that. Oh, okay. Oh, that's not good. Okay. So I think I'll be quiet there and I'll just let Karl say something. Apologies for that, Karl.
No worries. I can cut over to my screen here.
Yeah. So I'll stop sharing.
All right, hopefully everybody should be able to see my screen now. But on this screen here, we'll show just a quick demo of what we can do with another function that's within Microburst called getAZPasswords. Now, typically during a penetration test or while you're getting access to an Azure environment, at a certain role level, say contributor or higher, you typically have access to a number of different services that potentially contain clear text credentials. So we wrote getAZPasswords to extract all of those passwords out of different services that are available. So we'll just do a quick demo of that. We can see here that I imported the Microburst module. And then within that, we're going to run getAZPasswords with the modify policies as yes and export certs as yes. For the modify policies, that's going to modify any existing key vault policies that may restrict how we access key vaults. I did record this for a DEF CON talk that was earlier this year, so you'll see some DEF CON references here. Additionally, for the export certs, we'll be writing out any certificates that we pull from key vaults out to PFX files or whatever supported certificate file that we're pulling from the key vault for the certs. We can see app services, container registries, storage accounts. Let's see, I think we did automation accounts, AKS for Kubernetes. So going through a bunch of different services here, pulling out different credentials. We can see a couple of PFX files here, including a run as certificate for an automation account. And we put the output here out to out grid view. I'd recommend either doing out grid view or export CSV for the credential export. But here we can see a whole bunch of credentials that are no longer valid because this was my demo environment and have since deleted all of this. But we can see things like the AKS cluster service principal down at the bottom here, some Cosmos DB keys, storage account keys, all sorts of really interesting stuff. So kind of takeaway from this, for anybody that has contributor in an Azure subscription and you want to quickly enumerate any passwords, once you've compromised that subscription, get AZ passwords is a good option. So I think we're right up on time here, so I guess we'll allow for some questions right here. Do we have any questions from the chat?
We have one question. So in your experience, how successful is something like cert transparency for finding and expanding base strings for enumeration of other related resources?
That's pretty good. So using cert transparency to identify subdomains is usually a good kind of first step, and then using the different permutations. So if you know the application name, and then do permutations on that, like -dev, -test, whatever. Finding those different permutations where you might not have cert transparency that would expose that subdomain is certainly a good starter for those base names.
Cool. Any questions from the room? All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen.